All right, ladies and gentlemen, so now we are moving into our afternoon session. And this afternoon, we have our Bioethics Honors Program person who will serve as moderator is Hylton. She has so, when I first met her, we were talking about her future. I interview each student in the Bioethics Honors Program. I need to know personally where you're going, what you're going to do. We had this wonderful interview, and I asked her what's her interest, and she talked about political science. And she was speaking so fluently. I said, well, who most impressed you? And she says, Angela Rye. And it was funny that she said it because that's what I talked about, Angela Rye. So we have presented to us our presenters today, Ms. Nadinne Hylton, one of our bioethics honors major, honors program students. Thank you, Ms. Hylton.
Thank you, Dr. Hodge. So I have the honor and privilege of introducing you all to two phenomenal women. Our first keynote speaker is Sowande Mustakeem, Ph.D., who earned a bachelor's degree from Elon after completing an independent major in African American Studies. She received her master's degree in African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University in 2002 and earned her doctorate in comparative Black history from Michigan State University in 2008. She subsequently received a 2-year Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in history and a jointly appointed tenure-track position in history and African American and African Studies at Washington University. Sowande Mustakeem's award-winning Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage disrupts the narrative that focuses exclusively on plantation slavery. Mustakeem changes how readers understand the packaging process for how African captives became enslaved once they reached their final destinations. Slavery at Sea reveals for the first time how similar dimensions of land-based slavery were first expressed largely on board slaving vessels. By highlighting the lived experiences of those groups most neglected by prior scholars of the Middle Passage, women, children, the disabled, and the elderly, Mustakeem demonstrates how Atlantic slave ships were important areas of development to land-based methods of medical treatment and violence. Let's give her a hand up.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Is everyone awake and full and ready? Yeah, no, we're not talking about, well, it is. I just came from Penn, so I was just sort of opening up sort of like it's not always comfortable to talk about slavery and then yet to look at the sort of the history of exploits. Not the most exciting, but at the same time, I have to gauge where are we? Are we awake? Because I'm going to do my best to keep us awake. Are you all feeling the energy already? Yeah. Whoa, all right, I see you, bro. All right. So I just wanted to open up and thank Dr. Hodge and thank Dr. Warren and thank the entire university for my being here. First of all, this is the absolute first time that I have ever spoke at an HBCU. So thank you for the invitation. And I say that because I grew up in Atlanta, so I grew up around HBCUs and understanding the importance of it. However, my path navigated in different ways that we can talk about later that my mother understood me very well in terms of moving forward. But again, it is an honor to be here because, for a lot of reasons. One, because I'm standing, because we're all standing, because we're here, because there are people, as we know, who don't want us to be here, or they don't want to remember us, or that there is no history and that there are no institutions that center the Black experience. So today I want to talk, it's really more so conversational, because I write things in ways that are more conversational, but it's 3 parts, where essentially I'm going to open up with a story, because I got to keep you all engaged. But nonetheless, there's an important story of a woman who has become the anchor for all of what you're going to hear connected with the book. And then I will go into the book. And then the third part, which I thought would be extremely instructive, is to talk about this medical history course in the Black experience that I developed. And so that way we then can begin to think more solution-oriented, because we can remember the history, but yet what do we do and how do we train the future and moving forward from the undergraduate level and also the general public. So again, not privileging it just for doctors or medical students, but also thinking about the world and its knowing in every capacity. All right. On June 15th, 1791, sailor John Cranston gave testimony, quote, concerning a Negro woman said to have been thrown overboard off of the American slave vessel Pollard. He detailed the complex outplay of events, foregrounding the actions of Rhode Island slave trader and ship captain James DeWolf in the ensuing murder. Cranston's recollections, they reinforced the power that DeWolf held as master over both captives and sailors within the open sea. The locus of white male power, however, lies most prominently with the life of an enslaved Black woman weakened by smallpox, whose shipboard presence led to her treatment or mistreatment, but instead where she was viewed as a threat to the ship's voyage and envisioned future profits, thereby facilitating her death and complicating meanings on an enslaved body, both diseased and female. And she was sold into the global slave market, transported overseas, and thus unable to be returned back to Africa. So in the course of, quote unquote, 3 or 4 days, her disorder increased so as to become offensive and to render it dangerous for her to remain on board. Alarmed by her continued weakness, DeWolf called an emergency meeting with the vessel's crew to consider the most effective strategy for a Black woman, in fact, left in the archive. Her name, Negro Wench. So that, as you see, we're getting the renaming, whether a number, or again, in this one, in the archive, she's remembered as a Negro Wench, or middle-aged Negro Wench. But again, her medical condition and her final stay aboard the Polly, it mattered. And it mattered too, as we will see, about her disappearance. So playing upon the threat of contamination, DeWolf emphasized, quote, if we keep the slave here, she will give it to the rest, both sailors and those held captive, thereby creating an opportunity in his mind for an enslaved insurrection. So with an estimated 2 months left in their voyage, DeWolf reasoned that being unable to afford any effectual medical assistance if the smallpox spread, again in his mind, quote, the Negroes must be confined in the hold where this excessive heat would increase the effects of this disease. So the woman, therefore, had to be permanently removed. Captain Jim chose to act upon what he envisioned as the only option at his seafaring disposal. So again, we gotta remember, out in the middle of the ocean, we're not on a plantation. We're out in these worlds that are constructed by and governed by ship captains, sailors, and even more people in control, essentially over the containment and confinement of these enslaved people. So again, these fears of her that she would give it to the rest of them, Captain Jim, he chose to act upon it, but he also queried some sailors aboard the ship. And he asked these men if they were, quote, willing to heave the woman overboard. Essentially, are you willing to participate? And it generated, surprisingly, several unsatisfactory responses, counter to his deadly thoughts. Yet, once again, in his mind, quote, no alternative was left to save the crew and the cargo, again, from this Black woman, but to throw this one so dangerously infected overboard off the Polly. So the bonded woman's, her deadly fate, it loomed in his mind so much that they said that he talked of it 1 or 2 times the day before she was thrown overboard. And so invoking his power as shipmaster, DeWolf, he ordered another sailor, Thomas Gordon, to go up with him to the woman's separate holding, because they quarantined her, and they gave her an old blanket to heave over herself and a little bit of food, but essentially separate from the rest of the cargo. And once there, these 2 men, they, quote, lashed her in a chair. They tied a mask around her eyes and mouth, plausibly, to prevent, as we would imagine, any immediate bodily contact, as well as this woman seeing or somehow disrupting these men from restricting her movements. So with the tackle hooked upon the slings around the chair, this permitted DeWolf and Gordon to maneuver her down to the hands of 4 more sailors waiting below. So amidst the woman's removal off ship, each of these men became collective accessories in her forthcoming overthrow. Reinforcing his superiority in this role as shipmaster, the fundamental basis of Captain Jim's use of these 4 men, it rested on the practical dimension of removing the bondwoman off ship, which of course indelibly required many hands. So following transfer to the next level of the vessel, she was landed into the rails and lowered down by 2 sailors. And as they moved the captive female off the polly, her dangling body, again, in the chair, which they had tied her to, but dangling off the side of the ship, as they said, her body swayed right forward and left thence until she was dropped and left into the oceanic waters beneath. So once fully immersed in this makeshift watery grave, as the archive remembers her in her last final moments, she hollered after she was down. So again, I want to remind you, eyes covered, tied down to a chair, and then whether we say gently lowered off, that becomes homicidal murder in the sense of leaving someone to die in the middle of the ocean because, and this is where it becomes so important that I am here and we're all a part of this conversation because it opens up an important space to think about the treatment and what we do with those who perhaps are perceived as diseased or disabled. How do we treat them? Is it equal, or do we go to violent means? So, once fully immersed, again, she hollered after she was down, demonstrating that despite being enfeebled, she was alive. So according to Stockman and Clan, these 2 sailors, the jettison incident was, quote, far from being accompanied with malice or wantonness, meaning that, well, we weren't being mean, we didn't mean to, we had to, in their intentions against this woman. So again, instead, the circumstances at hand, they compelled DeWolf and the crew to adopt this disagreeable alternative as they kept invoking over and over to claim the necessary relief. Now, at the moment of the discovery of this woman's medical condition, what is important is that this difference, it grew drastically. And again, we're thinking about both her presence on ship, but then also still remembering her presence in that way. It transformed her body, as any and all enslaved people who were affected by ailments of many kinds. This is where we see the transforming of the body into something shameful and revolting, into something quite alienating to the other person, to these bodies. And we see the othering of Black bodies, as we know historically, in the evolution of Black history. But in this moment, as such, this othering of this woman, it moved her from the status of exploitable commodity, reinforcing, although we could say that it only exploited her even more, but reinforcing racial differences that further marked her body as thus African, female, diseased, and unwanted. Because yes, to have been bought as a viable and in that way to be able to base future profits off of this woman, then all of a sudden out in the middle of the ocean, you no longer matter, because then I'm able to read your body and what is going to happen even before you get to the plantations. So we may never really come to readily understand how and if the participating seamen ever replayed the jettison incident in their minds, or perhaps psychologically suppressed the final moments of her time aboard. But the alleged compulsory nature of the bondwoman's violent removal does not diminish the possibility of effect left upon them, and also left upon her shipmates, because coming up from the hold and then perhaps looking for a shipmate. But again, in this way, I'm trying to remind us to always think about on all sides of it. We don't know how people replay these things or how we're traumatized. And that bearing witness, as we were talking about at lunch, bearing witness to a moment then can impact you for the rest of your life. But what is so, this one quote that just will never leave, and everyone, they kind of respond in a particular way when you hear this. For DeWolf, again, the ship captain, age 26 at the time, the beginning of his career, unfazed by this black woman's forcible homicidal disappearance, apparently very near half an hour after this woman had been thrown overboard and the ship sailed onward away from her deserted body. A nearby sailor overheard him remark, "He was so sorry, he lost so good a chair." The chair that this woman was strapped to. So again, seeing more value in this chair than this woman. So this woman and this story has lived with me for a long time. And we can get into how even more deeply after that. But I don't want to say that she haunts me. Because to say that I'm haunted is to say that I'm afraid, but in fact, she has been the one that had given me deeper courage to question where and how, and if do black females alone even come into the conversation. More importantly, what happens if, say, you have smallpox? So for me as a black female in all the various years that I have been presenting on the Middle Passage, one of the biggest questions is where and how do black females fit? And then when you add in a diseased female, what does that mean? Do we want to claim someone in that particular narrative? So I shared this woman's story, although brief, and before I go on, I actually want to share something that all of it's great to be able to have this medical conversation, because when we think about black history or the folklorizing in many ways, so I'll get into that a little bit further in, but I'll share that no American journal would publish this article about this woman's story. Right. No American journal. And in fact, I got comments back like, well, duh, the slave trade's bad, or what is there to learn from a black woman left for dead in the ocean? I cried, I sent it to this journal, I get back, oh, that's so cute, no, we're not interested. And I sent it to a British journal, snapped it up, published in 9 months. It now is my most popular article in the world of all of my work. But I don't say this to sort of say, okay, look at me, but it's more so about why is it that it took until 2011 that this would be the first and essentially still the only history written. Yes, we have 2 articles, but maybe mine will be considered in a particular way. But 2011 is when we're now really maybe, and again, the fact that it was not seen as valuable on this side of the Atlantic, it troubled me. So inevitably, as you can imagine, trying to write the book while finishing this article, so what I was smart in doing was I took this woman's story out of my dissertation because I felt her story was so important to stand on its own. Because if not, then, a lot of people love numbers. And when we love numbers, and we forget to love the people who are affected by this. Whether we're saying 100 million, or how low we'll go with Philip Curtin and 12 million and 10 million and 11 million, I can quote all of that. But as I always encourage my students, whether it was 2 or 200, what did they go through? And yet, more importantly, where and how do we even place the slave ship experience in the Middle Passage within our histories? So as you were hearing about the introduction of my work, it's been a battle for a long time that people would always say to me, oh, there's no room for slave ships. Oh, we already know about slavery. Oh, we already know about, they were freed, and then we got the Civil Rights Movement. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, we're literally jumping off the coast of Africa, landing ourselves into plantations, and then slavery happens, and then we get freedom. But in the process, you have bypassed the entire process that I argue leads to and is totally this full solidification of the making and unmaking of enslaved people. Now I want to explain how I did that. Because trust me, to be award-winning definitely involves some deeper thought. In this book, the fact that it will win the best book for the history of the African diaspora in 2017, that is because of how I wrote it. And the first thing was essentially renaming the slave trade. Sure, we know transatlantic slave trade, we know it, great. But what is it? What does it mean? And so what I did is I added a more sophisticated understanding so we could understand it as a human-created enterprise. So in that sense, I renamed it as the human manufacturing system. And within that, there are three important components. Because the book itself, it goes from the point of capture to the point of sale. However, when I say the point of sale, that does not mean that I'm in a plantation. I stopped the book on purpose, so that way then plantation scholars can pick up where I began. But the three important phases that I argue that really contribute to the making and unmaking, whether we're thinking medically, physically, psychologically, any and all of it, it's predicated upon warehousing, transport, and delivery. Sounds pretty economical, doesn't it? And that way, because we think about the manufacturing process, the making of something to make it that sellable. So in this way, this is where, throughout the book, it is very centered on the body. It is very centered on trauma. And I go from this point of capture and then also thinking about the types of people that we remember. Because to say the slaves had it bad is just not going to work. Because in our long memory of the slave trade in the Middle Passage, unfortunately it's been based solely on the bodies of adult black men. But what does that tell me about a black female who had a miscarriage on board a slave ship?
Right.
No woman can die from a torn scrotum. What does that tell me about that experience? So I go to 25 archives across the world. I've gone to medical libraries in England, here, all over, really going with this one question about the slave ship experience. And through that, that's when I began to realize that in our remembering, we don't even realize that we're calling a 2-year-old girl a woman. A girl, a young girl, a baby is not a woman. So in that way, we have to really think about the categories. And then in the categories, not just of those taken, sold, seen as viable commodities, we can't forget those left behind. And there's a whole really interesting category for those who don't know that I call attention to, and wow, it definitely upset some people, because how dare I talk about the mistreatment of a category called refused slaves. And for those, if you think about even that word refuse, that's trash. Essentially throwaways, nobody wants you. And so in the book, you even get not just the passing over, no, not that one, but for some, they would be beheaded in that moment. You have no value in the white gaze if you cannot contribute to the system. And this is just on the African side of the Atlantic. And then once we're on the ship, then we have to think about cleanliness and water, the allocation of water, or the small, meager amounts of food. What types of food? Are they all going to have healthy food? So what I do is I go through that even where we do find the limitations that ship captains will be forced with. Let's say you had planned for 3 months on the coast, and it ended up being 6 months. So then perhaps to be forced to feed enslaved people molded bread. Or just, again, all of these sort of inferior types of food that then we would be forced to have to sustain ourselves with. But out in the middle of the ocean, what was important for me, not just with cleanliness, not just with the diet and the beginning disease transmission, but breaking down categories that we're all guilty of, where we want to conflate resistance into one big lump sum. And what I did is I spread it apart in 2 chapters. So that meant where we could have an intelligent conversation around violence. Yes, slave ship revolts, but looking at violence, perhaps even the violent treatment of newborns, throwing them overboard because they were screaming too loud. Then reserving necessary conversation on the mind, the emotions, the mental health, and looking at suicide. Yeah, but there's so many different forms. You can have people jump overboard. But what about those who said is enough? Sure, they may have swallowed their tongue, they may have hung themselves, they may have clawed at their throat in order to cut their own throat. And all of this becomes important because this is contributing to this making, the unmaking of freedom. It is gone, it is dissolving. And when we look at the actors that I'm centering, it is slave ship captives, it is sailors, but I'll also center slave ship surgeons. Because here it is that you have a professional class represented on board a slave ship that would have ready access to even more black bodies around the globe. And so I argue for this thing of these like migratory medical apprenticeship. In that way, you're sailing on these ships and you're getting access everywhere you go. And it didn't matter, some of these doctors didn't know what they were doing. Some of them even fraudulently even lied to say that they could treat anybody, and then they get there and they can't deal with it. So then that contributes to the failing health of enslaved people because of the dynamics of power and who runs this ship that you would see play out from slave ship surgeons as well as ship captains. So again, when we think about this history, and also I want to mention that I have a whole chapter where I break down as many diseases as possible that I do find on slave ships, because again, you have these series of mortality lists. So again, really just trying to complicate this narrative of what does death look like? How is death treated? And in fact, I'll even share that of course we have these very racialized ideas that are always fueling the trade, even more when there's commentary about the involvement. So when we get to testimony given before the British House of Commons, and one surgeon, he was unable to treat a ailing black man. He couldn't figure out what was going on with him. So what he did that night is he waited until everyone was asleep, and then he said he worked by candlelight to perform an autopsy. But yet he did it at night because he was afraid of how that would look to these other captives. What was interesting in reading the records is that then these judges, they were asking, like, did you cut open his brain? Did you see how small his brain was? Or again, just sort of this access and what does that mean and how much are you taking advantage of it or not? So again, it's not just one, it's many people that will be participants and recipients of this history. And one other important aspect that I want to mention from the book is that I talk about the importation of people who are coming in without an eyeball, missing fingers, missing hands, but they weren't always bought that way. So in that way, then you see the literal making of enslaved people through the precise nature and the tools that are used in order to keep them confined at sea. So at the end of the day, I wrote this book so people could feel, so you could remember, so that you can never again exclude black females and everybody from this narrative, because if we're not talking about the disabled, we're not talking about elderly, we're not talking about children. So in this regard, this book for the first time really puts all of us together. It puts everyone together in a way that is not so much about trying to create a perfect narrative, but it's about understanding an actual system. And so this system would extend itself to J. Marion Sims, to Crawford Long, to exactly with the experiment here. So again, it becomes this recipient of racialized ideas that just only go on and on and on, like, well, you know, they're just black and, oh, well, you know, pain is no big deal. So again, it becomes sort of this recycled idea racially that will be used against and used on black bodies. And in fact, I have to say, just a side note, when I was hearing you talk about J. Marion Sims, see, I'm from Atlanta, and it was later on in graduate school, again, with my becoming more interested in medical history, and we think about we can live in these worlds and we may not even know it. And the fact that I was close to Crawford Long, I would hear about, didn't know anything about him. And then you go to graduate school, so we're talking about anesthesia. Here it is the father of anesthesia who would perform these experiments. And yet, again, looking at this legacy, just this a shared understanding, both Southern and Northern, but nonetheless global in terms of how the black body can fit in the need, in all of it. So, and again, in all of it, I try to talk about as much medical as I can, but more so getting us to think about the body, think about the history, and think about the people we choose to remember, and then those that we don't. And so this other part of the talk that I want to kind of go into, that, because I'm very solution oriented. You know, we can talk about history and say, well, they need to read and they need to know and all that, and we're living in some very interesting times where everybody doesn't read, you know, or we scroll too much and I forgot to read that book. Meaning that we're dealing with shifting generations, and yet my way of beginning to address this need to read or to think about the past was developing an undergraduate course to prepare those who want to go to med school or want to go into public health, because we can't just leave it at slavery. This is where now medical education becomes so important. So within this course that I had developed that now I've taught for 10 years, and there's all kinds of students that have come through in residency or done or just starting. It's about learning how we inform and racially inform each other and those who are going to be in charge of healthcare in the future to be extremely cognizant of the past that you are choosing to walk in. And so within this course, we go from the slave trade to contemporary. And through it, we're moving through it's almost in many ways a snapshot. So we're moving through space and time, and yet, well, not yet. I use Tuskegee as that bridge. But what's interesting is that as time is going on, and while we may assume that everyone is remembering, they're not. So that means that you can know the name, but then you don't know the history itself. But creating this pre-Tuskegee and then post-Tuskegee. So in that way, to get this bigger, broader narrative means that we're all of a sudden seeing this experimental study in the context of Henrietta Lacks. And then sort of moving into what happens if you stand up for civil rights and all of a sudden you're thrown into an insane asylum in the 60s, in the 70s. Or, well, as we're seeing more black people go to prisons, and all of a sudden we're looking at drug treatment programs. And then looking at, again, the medical world and its constant interplay within our lives in ways that we may choose to remember, and then at times that we may not. And so then that's where we have to be very cognizant of the cost of silences. I can't say that enough because, and even to go back to this woman's story, hearing it, it's like it didn't happen. And then the fact to have a black female or a black person telling the story, I have seen the ugly in Americans oftentimes. So that means that at one conference when I presented about this story, so again, this is when we're going back to what I was mentioning earlier about the folklorizing. So to not talk about it is to deny its existence. But I was at one conference where I had mentioned this, I told the story, and I had someone in the audience say, well, why'd they throw her over? When you take her by the neck, I'm gonna take her by the neck and grab her and throw her overboard. You said that out loud? And I'm sitting here thinking, and the next thing you know, it became a domino effect. I would have shot her in the head. I would have just tossed her overboard. And I'm just really sitting there like, who's gonna stop this? And it just became even more of sort of this racial moment. What would I do if I had somebody's disease and I could not believe it? I've had so many people come up to me and say, you're lying, you're making this up, or how'd you get access being this black woman? And I'm like, the racial politics of slavery and us remembering, what does that mean? Do we want to just remember so-called happy times, or do we begin to actually probe the trauma? And what does that mean in a nation that is unwilling to even apologize for slavery? Okay, so the actual state that I'm from, Georgia, have you all heard an apology from there? And what does it mean to apologize in that way? So I bring all this up because a lot of people, they oftentimes will try. And of course, thankfully, with today and with this week, we're thinking about the 400 plus years. Because it is more than 40. It's more than 8 years, more than 10 years. And in fact, it's more than 400. We got almost 600 years. But yet, where and how do we remember? Who do we remember? What are we privileged? And yet, what do we do with that history and the making of it? So again, I mentioned about the medical history course because I see that we're not asking that enough in the teaching of it. And so then that raises that conversation, when do we start talking about slavery? When do we start talking about the medical exploit? How early? How late? So in this course, in fact, I'll even give you the title of it. It's called Medicine, Healing, and Experimentation in the Contours of Black History. And I'm teaching students who want to go to med school. And so that means that when you get out of here, you're going to know about the Black experience. Because to go to med school informed. So this is where, in looking at the future of medical education, the future of all of us, we talk about public and public health. The one thing that comes to mind for me, public, is that which is seen. because you're always going to have the unseen. And I talk about that in the book, so we have to be aware of that, about that which you know about. And then there are those major aspects that we don't know about, that affects us, that affects our history. So again, public has a variety of meanings for me, but inevitably it has a variety of meanings and utility for the world that we live in. So I'll so-called in here, and I know that we will open up for even more conversation, but the other thing I wanted to point and call attention to really quick is that, and I can play some of it a little bit later, I had the nerve to put together a book soundtrack. And I did this so that way there is sort of tapping into sound and audio and the power of that. I'm drumming, I'm in a band, I do drums, I can play like 5 at a time. And so in it, what I did is I titled every song after the title of every chapter in the book. And then, so again, maybe at the end of our entire panel, then I can play that 6-minute sort of outro where I'm reading from the book so you all can experience that. And let's see if I can get over there. And I wanted to show you all this. Now let's see if we can read it. Do I have to go up here?
Yeah, do one.
I'll try. Woo! Getting there. All right. Yeah. Can y'all read it? Or maybe that's what I'm supposed to go get it. Hopefully you can read it. If not, I'm not reading that out loud. That's too long. Anyway, essentially this is a description for this popular medical history course, the one that I've just kind of been alluding to, that I teach every year, and it's working. So in that way I bring it up just so we all can begin to sort of think about curriculum, and we think about curriculum building that demands race be first in our understanding, and more importantly, when we're thinking about the Black experience. So I'll leave that there for a moment as we do the transition, but I really, really look forward to the engagement and the dialogue on all of this. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much, that was wonderful. So our respondent is Nadinne Cruz. Nadinne Cruz has served as Executive Director of the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs in Minnesota, where she developed international and local community-based learning programs. At Stanford University, she was Director of the Haas Center for Public Service. She has also taught at Swarthmore College and at Carleton College. She is a co-author of Service Learning, a movement's pioneers reflect on its origins, practice, and future, and works with colleges and universities across the United States on their national and state campus compacts. As an elder in retirement, Nadinne is interrogating her experiences with intergenerational trauma and exploring how to integrate personal healing with social responsibilities to address systematic injustices. Give her a hand of applause.
I'm going to need some help to put up a few slides, but first, I want to thank Dr. Warren, Dr. Hodges, Sowande, Mustakeem, Professor, and thank you for the introduction. I was very reluctant to come to Tuskegee because I felt like I would be an interloper on sacred ground. When there isn't a shared memory at the level of intimacy that I felt was necessary to have permitted presence on sacred ground, I felt the need to walk to the tombs of Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, and ask permission. I hope to be able to share a little bit of a glimpse of a mental map of why I think that the work of Professor Mustakeem is absolutely, urgently necessary. And how it is that it is so complex, and yet hopefully there are parts of it that are as simple as doing it and being it. I am somewhat of a maverick in higher education, having spent 30-some years in leadership positions at institutions that are considered elite. I'm a maverick because I shed off all the typical stuff that you say about people who spend their lives teaching in those places. And so I prefer to call myself a recovering academic. And hopefully in the vein or in the spirit of heal thyself. But before I share that mental map with you, I want to say it's a mental map that makes sense to me of why this work is so important. The work that's represented here is so urgently important, even though at the same time and simultaneously I interrogate the hegemonic position that academic scholarship has taken to silence all the other voices that have something to say. But before I do that, you must read the book.
And her copy looks better than mine.
It is like this because I'm one of those people that has a hard time marking up the books because I see them once I note that, wow, this is a wow book, I can hardly make myself put my imprint on it. So I make all these marks, but I'm just going to read one part. You must read the book because there are parts of it that I think you have to just stop and grieve. There is no other honorable way to proceed but to stop and to grieve. It is the details of those women's lives that you give that I so admire and respect. Everything from looking at women's breasts to determine whether they would be healthy enough or attractive enough to be bought at high wages, at high prices, or not, because they're missing some bodily part that would give a good price. And to give medical attention, doing a kind of cost benefit analysis to see if they were worthy of sufficient or a type of medical attention, because if you give too much, then you're spending too much expenditures on stuff that needs to command a price. Or if you didn't spend enough time medically, you might have losses and casualties and not command a good enough price. This was not about the health of people. This was about a system of production. So it's masterful writing. It is scholarship that I admire and respect. It's not scholarship for the sake of 10 more books or 10 more reproducible, in my view, articles, but it's truly seminal work and ground path-breaking. And I just want to read one part of it towards the end, just to give you a summary, which doesn't do justice to the details, but in many ways, it is both the summary, the lenses by which one sees the system as a whole, and the details contextualized within that summary and the dialogue between the two, the small minutia of the details, as well as the lens that gives you a bigger picture. It's the two together that is so masterful and so brilliant. Closely tracing the sequential process brown people confronted through the three-phased manufacturing process: warehousing, transport, and product delivery. This book diverges from the predominance of tracing disconnected merchants, rebellious adult black male slaves, and triangulated goods moving across the Atlantic. It centers the forcible movement of slaves across continents as more than a simple trip, event, cruise ship, or historical moment, but instead as a terrorizing process fueled through investments that served as financial deposits, igniting the devastation of lives through the Middle Passage. Framing the slave trade as a central part of what is herein described as a human manufacturing system that produced a multi-centuried slaving process, this book expands the intellectual landscape of slavery to better show the interconnectedness of power, the diversity of enslaved resistance, the socio-medical history of illness and death, diet, toxicity, and medical treatment, the treatment of the dead, and most of all, the painful and enduring legacies of slavery's terror. Sowande Mustakeem asks the question, to know is to awaken and acknowledge, repair, and restore meanings of the past, while silences maintain the unawakened and uninformed. This book exposes the normalized, grueling, and rather gut-wrenching aspects of a global slaving industry. So there's just part of the passage, it's a must-read book. In the next few moments, I want to tell you why I'm going to tell you why I live in the contradiction of two things, at least a pair of contradictions that I have lived with for a very long time. So I asked myself the question, what is my response to what this book describes? So I go back to when I was first awakened to the depths of poverty where I am from, the Philippines. I saw things and yet didn't see things. I saw things every day that I didn't see. That's a contradiction. But when I finally saw what I saw every day in a different way, my first reaction was to look at all that is dystopic. So I began to read and to understand the socially constructed systems of human suffering that we have lots of names for. Racism, classism, feudalism, colonialism, imperialism, lots of isms. But we have mountains of scholarship on all these systems that have created human suffering. And my youthful energies were focused on that dystopia, and the mode of reaction was resistance, struggle, and fighting against. But I did not start out with what I'm associated with today as a so-called pioneer of service learning and civic engagement education. I did not think of service, help, or civic engagement. When you are fighting against systems of injustice, when people were fighting in the civil rights struggle, I don't think they said, I'm civically engaged. There's something very depoliticizing about that. I think the mode that I felt most comfortable with in a struggle, which is a power struggle, is allyship, solidarity, and coalition, which requires understanding who are my people. And my people are those who are awakened to be able to see what they haven't seen before, but with new lenses of understanding that this is not episodic or individual, but is systemic, sustained over time, and humanly constructed, developed, and maintained. I spent many years in a fight mode until I realized I was dying inside. So, in desperation, which is a different kind of a desperation of, I would call, moral injury or moral disorientation, I turned to another way, and that is to look at, well, if I'm against this, what am I for? And I realized that the creating of the utopic, that which I wish could be in place instead of what I say I do not want, is very hard work because it requires imagination. I must be able to imagine the ideal that it doesn't exist, that is a counter to that which I know a lot about. And it requires vision. And it requires, in many ways, just an artist. An artist renders into something through some medium, that which one has imagined, and render it into being. And so I think of this as engaging and participating in creating the ideal. So when people say community building, that is one form. When we care about community, or immediate community, or a global community, or a nationwide peoples, we are imagining what the ideal is and creating that. And I call that civic arts, literally an artistic, a public artistry. But in order to do that, when you've had, as Paulo Freire has wonderfully, horribly described in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is that schooling snuffs out imagination. And schooling, as we know from Carter Woods' Miseducation of the Negro, from Renato Constantino's Miseducation of the Filipino, and many other works that interrogates colonial mentality or the enslaved mind, we know that that which might give us the power to see something different can be snuffed out of us. And so I ask you to think about a circle of knowledge. What if we could imagine a circle that contains everything we need to know, everything that we need to be able to do in order to create a good world? Think about the people of Le Chambon in southern France, who, a small population, about 3,000, mostly subsistence farmers, harbored about the same number of Jews fleeing the Holocaust over a period of years. They were unlettered. They are not put up in a Schindler's List kind of movie. It seems that they are some of the unknowns who are embodiments of goodness. And I've asked myself the question, what if we created and developed colleges and universities such that they were designed to make it possible for graduates to do what the people of Le Chambon did? What would we teach? How would we teach? So I imagine a circle in which all the knowledge that we would need in order to be able to learn how to do good is in that circle. What would be in that circle? That little wedge would be the academy, in my view. Heretical position, especially for people who are paying thousands of dollars in tuition. But we would know peace work and storytelling and healing. We would know courage. We'd learn justice work and community building. We'd learn how to steward the earth. We'd learn compassion and truth-telling and reconciliation. But the dominant paradigms are being reproduced in the academies. so that we teach economics in such a way that wealth creation and trickle down are taken for granted in social entrepreneurship as a response to poverty, for example. So the dominant paradigms in the academy have not honored all the other ways of knowing that are not codified in European Western scholarship, but are nonetheless urgently needed by all of us to learn, not in an episodic, accidental way, but in a sustained, organized fashion. And so my work has been about the creation of building bridges between the truth-telling and the knowledge that we call community-based ways of knowing and academic scholarship through programs like what I call community-based learning programs that are all over the world that I used to head in this 18-college consortium. And then I created an honors program at Stanford called the Public Service Scholars Program, which combined the best of seniors doing honors with very high-level work of academic scholarship integrated with that scholarship being of benefit to and serving communities. In any case, I'm saying that the circle is bigger than the academy. But at the same time, remember I began by saying Showanda's work is absolutely urgently needed, and I will get to how that we come together. So experiences wake us up. There are many people who cannot read books because they have no meaning for them. But if there are experiences that drives a question so deeply and so passionately, I need to know why there is such an economic such that people sell people, even today. I need to know economics such that why is it that Philippines' biggest contributor to the Philippines' GDP is sojourner labor. That means millions of Filipinos do not live with their families because they travel the world, to Saudi, to Germany, to everywhere to earn a living. So, it is not enough to be awakened by personal experiences of witnessing devastation and suffering at the hands of other humans, because so much of that is so complex to explain. Experience alone is not enough. Imagination, ideas, consciousness, concept, paradigms, theories, these are lenses which shape judgment and informs action. They matter. Is poverty due to misfortune or injustice? You think I'm being rhetorical. This is a real question to a lot of people. A lot of people cannot imagine that poverty is due to any injustice. They assume it must be your fault. That is a powerful paradigm with which no amount of data or evidence will disconfirm, because it's a paradigm. So, if our frameworks or our lenses inform understanding and response, do you respond with wealth creation or economic justice? I have lots and lots of former students who are absolutely devoted to social entrepreneurship, wealth creation as the answer to poverty, worldwide, everywhere. That is a paradigm. It's very powerful. Is it due to misfortune or injustice? Again, I have talked with people who are convinced they made wrong choices. That's why. There is no immaculate perception, borrowing from my former Roman Catholic background. We do not see in the raw. And so, lots of works talk about the interrogation of ways of knowing, of epistemology itself, of what we assume. is the knowledge that has the authority to speak, and that which we need to learn in order to make our way in the world. And so I think the whole circle is urgently needed, not just one part of the circle. We need to decolonize that part of that circle. And that is precious territory because it's organized, it's institutionalized, it has norms, it could be used for the good. And if we connect the academy with community-based ways of knowing, I think we are able to integrate the whole of that exists in the universe of knowledge. But it requires the academy to decenter itself, to not see itself as the be-all and end-all of the entire circle of knowledge. So I want to end here by saying, I started out by thinking, well, what's wrong with schooling is that it's about teaching and learning, it's about pedagogical approaches. So we try pedagogical innovation, like service learning, civic education, field-based, experiential education, project-based learning. We have many names for all kinds of groovy ways to teach that it's not just lecture. I started doing that, but pretty soon I got into, but what is it that we wish to teach when we teach differently, innovatively? And I started thinking it's not just new information for students, but also about a whole world in which there are many different epistemologies, and they need to be interrogated, such as what Linda Tuwihai-Smith did as a Maori professor in New Zealand who wrote the book Decolonizing Research Methodologies, where she summarized the whole of Western European scholarship first, and then talks about Maori ways of knowing. But I think the real driver in all this, that which makes meaning of the whole thing, is what do I want to be? And what is the world I want to create? That should drive the answer to the question how we should teach and what it is that we should teach. What is the world that we want to have instead of the one that we opine? And we're going to end here. That is 4 generations. My 97-year-old mother, my 32-year-old daughter, myself, and our 3-year-old granddaughter. I end there by saying, I'm 3rd generation experiencer of intergenerational trauma. My father was gunned down and killed in front of us in our home when I was 4. My mother abandoned her body when that happened. In other words, she became clinically detached. She became a neurologist. As a widow with 2 children, she came to Indiana University from the Philippines to study in a field where at the time there were no men in her class. They didn't speak to her because she didn't belong. She had 2 kids, which, what is she doing here? So for the first year, I think she got the silent treatment. She didn't exist. But she was talented in a peculiar kind of way. She could teach anatomy, and with 2 hands and colored chalk, draw every tissue, every anatomical part accurately, etc. During World War II, she was engaged to a fellow medical student who was gunned down and killed in front of her by an American soldier who thought he was the enemy because Asians all looked alike. In the history of the Philippines, as you probably know, there is that tragic book, if you ever come across it, called Smoked Yankees. Have you ever seen that book? It's a collection of letters home by African American soldiers who were in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. Many of those letters ask the question, what are we doing here killing these brown people? My mother's mother was confined to bed from the time my mother was born until she died 5 years later, so my mother is 5. I think they did not know how to treat diabetes. And she had a mole that festered, and they did all kinds of things to it that were medically, probably today, not a good thing to do. My mother was burned 3rd degrees from here to here, and they would pour paraffin on it and pull out the scabs. Her shrieks were heard all over the neighborhood. And my father's mother died giving birth to him. So I carry my father's mother's name, middle name, Irene, or Irene. I say all this in reference to Sowande's book. When I was reading it, I was triggered over and over again. And our experiences of trauma were not systemic, collective, and sustained over time, as what was depicted here. So I'm saying that I could appreciate those women's untold stories in ways that were really, really deeply felt by my own experiences of trauma and the challenge of a lifetime, and I indeed will end here, of how to answer the question, how might I integrate my own challenges to heal my personal traumas and have that be part of a foundation for a very heavy fire in the belly that will not go out to participate in fights and struggles against social injustices that even to this day cannot be seen because the lenses that we have to see them are flawed. And that is the job of educators, of teachers, of those who dare with passion to inquire, to tell the truth, to tell the stories, because the lenses allow us to see what those sailors did not see. When the suckling baby was just ripped off and thrown because they would bring no value. When the mothers would cry and they would say, oh, now the mothers will be depressed, they will bring less value. It is the lenses to see. Who taught those sailors to not see? Who taught the merchantmen to not see? Who taught the captain of the ship to not see? That is systemic, institutionalized paradigms that those people were schooled in. And we have to interrupt that pattern of reproduction of schooling. And this space is so important a gathering. I recognized it so much from the beginning that I could barely make myself come here because I do so honor that effort. Thank you.
please take 1 minute to formulate your questions as we enter into the question and answer period.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was so meaningful and so touching. Thank you. That was very powerful. So we're going to open up for questions now. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand.
Well, hello, it's Akil Gregory from Morehouse School of Medicine. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Mustakeem and Dr. Nadinne Cruz, for your time here and just sharing your experiences. My question was more so directed to the diagram that Ms. Cruz showed at the end of her presentation about the pedagogy, epistemology, and ontology. With regard to paradigms that are learned from different contexts, as was given with the Slavery at Sea book, translating into the present. A quote comes into mind that makes it difficult, in my opinion, to shift that paradigm that is becoming more apparent by the day, year, etc. And that would be, to paraphrase it, it is easier to raise strong children than to repair broken men and women like that. So when we're in the context of people living longer and carrying those lenses for a longer period of time, how do we articulate, form conversations to shift paradigms that are so deeply embedded in individuals who are living long? Like specifically to those who may be in positions of power, but also may just be carrying paradigms from 2 generations ago.
I would imagine doing if somebody would give lots of money, I would imagine a program here at Tuskegee with the people who are already here and the Sowande and others for elderly people or people in executive leadership positions. They have all kinds of adventure tour programs. People pay a lot of money for something unique and different learning. And I think we shouldn't give up on, I'm 70 now and I feel like I'm just starting over. And I am deliberately putting myself in a position of having a beginner's mind. And so I think we're missing the boat that there is still the possibility of creating educational programs for people in the latter stages of their lives. I suspect that if we could create cohorts who are in, I hate to use the phrase safe learning, because I'm thinking, anyway, healthy learning environments, it might be possible to interrogate paradigms that have not been useful, that are broken, that have not worked. And it's everything in the health industry. I mean, we call it health industry, right? And the difference between medical treatment and healing and all of that I think people in this later stage of life would be willing to interrogate treatment, healing, living, and so forth. That's my guess.
Thank you. That's a tough question. I was over here racking my brain like, yeah, we are living longer. And what does that mean? And one of the most important things is the cross-generational dialogue. So that means that we privilege the young, and we don't ever really make this, we don't ever cross the line to have more conversations beyond like, how good was life for you? Like meaning looking at, what have you lived with? And what can I learn from in that way? So again, thinking about the cycles of trauma that we carry and that left unspoken or not learned from even within our own family, then it only devastates the future. So in that way, we have to be extremely attentive to how much we are basing solely on the young, whatever young is. Okay? And we have to begin to sort of broaden out, thinking about programs, thinking about different spaces, both inside and as well as outside of academia, that begins to bring us together. So if that's creating huge oral history projects that go within and beyond the civil rights movement, but again, to really center trauma in these ways, that can be instructive for us in the future, because before too long, the civil rights movement will be 100 years ago. And that can't be all we're talking about. There has to be, again, all the many layers of the experience. So that's my best effort in trying to give you an intelligent response. But really, we need to all be in dialogue is what I would say. And again, cross-generational.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Calvin Pegas. I'm also from Morehouse School of Medicine. Thank you both for presenting. I was touched because I agree that Dr. Mustakeem,
Yes.
you don't necessarily hear this narrative from the women's experience, and I think it's really important, especially for males as well. What I was thinking as you both were speaking was kind of this connection of the way that women's health is presented today. We see this issue around maternal health among Black women, and I'm wondering if, because these narratives aren't out there, that physicians are still having this really hurtful relationship with Black women in the medical setting.
Yeah.
And if you can tell me how important it is for us to continue to have this dialogue, one. Two, Ms. Cruz, you mentioned interrupting patterns of reproduction, and so how can that be done, especially when we're looking at this lens of implicit bias and how that's brought into the medical setting for Black women?
Thank you for that. I'm always happy when people are moved. That means you're listening, you're thinking, and guess what? You're human and you're feeling. So we do forget that, especially in academia. It's like you can't cry, you gotta keep it all together. But again, when we feel, then we're moved. So it's extremely important that we talk about this. I have to say, when I think about the assault on Black women, or how we begin to sort of think about the conversations around Black women, I go back to Moynihan. I go back to that report that's blaming all these Black women about how they're raising these inferior households because of this, because of that, and then yet there were those that predated Moynihan. And so yet it is about us, this is where the conversation, to look historically about what was said, where are we now, and then yet the privileging, again, to go back to that, what do we choose to include in the conversation? So if we're thinking about the health, then we have to think about the mind, the body, the spirit. The first thing that really is coming to mind is thinking about Beth Ritchie's book. She wrote this really important book called Arrested Justice. And it's looking at Black women who are living within these worlds of prison, or living within, or surrounded by violence. But yet when we privilege the conversation solely on Black men and the prison industrial system, then we don't think about the women, the females, the families that are left outside of it. And I will add that I'm one of those, in the sense that I go to jail, but my dad went to jail twice. And so to be on the outside, and again, I'm never a part of those conversations because I don't matter to other people. So again, we have to sort of like reframe the conversations around what is health, what does it look like, how do we manage that on all sides? Because again, when I'm still hearing the dying Black man, and I don't hear anything about Black females, Black women, Black girls, we might get some Black girl magic a little bit here and there, we're not where we need to be. And again, when I can be at conferences and people come up to me and say, oh my God, I totally forgot Black women were on slave ships, then we have not learned. Then the conversation has not gone deep enough, and we've left it too iconic. So I would kind of get that. Sorry.
I don't know how to solve that problem of historical amnesia. It shouldn't have been a surprise what happened with Serena Williams. Everybody was shocked. Oh, a celebrity, how could that happen? But if we know enough history, it shouldn't have come as a big surprise. So the question that I've been raising with experimenting with pedagogical innovation has been how to motivate people to do the hard work. And it's hard intellectual labor to inquire in such a way that you dig at the meaningful details in order to get the picture. But how to be motivated to do that, I was thinking, was through field study and experiential learning, because that's when people get awakened and motivated. I think that's at least part of the answer. But to interrupt the reproduction, I want to just tell you a little story. When I was at Stanford, I lived for 7 years with my husband. I still live with him, 34 years now. To say that we survived living for 7 years with our 2 kids, 2 dogs, and 100 Stanford students. 7 years in the Asian American undergraduate residence. When I was there, I was asked if they could use our small resident fellow cottage to have a meeting among medical students. And one of my former students, who was then had graduated to become a student at the Stanford Medical School, had organized a group, and they all came, and we were like this. I think there must have been 40-some people in this tiny little cottage, and I asked, why are you here? And at first I thought they would just give a collective answer, one of those, we're organized to do such and such, and we're meeting to do this. One by one, it was like they were compelled, they had to say one by one, I came to school because I thought I was going to, I am the only Native American who's gone to, I am the only one in my family. It was one after another, story like this. And I thought I was going to be trained to be able to serve my community. And there's nothing in the curriculum that will help me to do that. So they went through the whole thing about how do you change a curriculum, how do you do this, how do you change medical practice training. I said, you might have to just make up the curriculum, design it, present it through the formal process. And you know what? They did, and they achieved it. And today there is a community-based health clinic and whole kinds of alternative modalities of healing that is part of the curriculum now. And they just had to do it. I think they couldn't wait. It would take forever to get to people who are concerned about tenure, people who are concerned about, the regular faculty. Students have a certain kind of power that people who are employees don't. And so think about that.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your insights today. Definitely very grateful to hear that, Dr. Mustakeem and Ms. Cruz. My name is Celia Zudiagu. I am a preventive medicine resident physician from the Area Medical College. My initial question you actually started to answer, both of you. The question really was what ideas you had on pushing forward the narrative to bring the experience of the Black woman to light. Especially, both of you hit on a very important note, which is that we are, as Black women, the invisible other. The male experience really is the normative, and of course the standard is the white male experience. But when you counter that, it's the Black male. And your discussion about what happened during the Mid-Atlantic slave trade, I think was very poignant and does point towards where things are now. But what I wanted to get some insight from you were, where do you think we can go as far as addressing the issues affecting women of color, and also Black women too? And I know a lot of times when we have these conversations, they tend to center around women who are predominantly underserved. But while every woman of color experiences, even if she is a high-powered person, even if she comes from, has managed to make it out of said environment, negative environment, does still experience levels of that trauma. And just as you commented on the effects of what happened to Serena Williams and why we shouldn't be surprised that it happened to her and countless others. And we can even get in as far as the dialogue of the low birth weights that African American women experience and how that also transcends. It's bigger than just women living in urban settings, but women who are professionals who are now more established, who otherwise would be at the same space demographically as their white counterparts still do experience some of those traumas. So I guess my new question is, how do we address the issues currently facing women of color and bringing forward the experiences out of the light, really making us more or less of a silent partner in the fight for justice and health, and basically in social settings, really, in all areas of social injustice.
I think I have less to say, but only that we look at the design of curricula. Are there courses? Are there women faculty? Women of color faculty? In my day in graduate school, there was one woman faculty in my entire department. Is there a support group for discussion? Because a lot of this isn't only the curricular information, but it's the self, the me, who is inquiring, that needs the support to push for the inquiry and to discuss. I feel that I have a lot more today to contribute as a person who has acted out trauma behavior, and that despite lifelong chronic depression and a lot of behaviors that are really the behaviors of trauma victims, more women of color, I think, could be helped if I could be part of that discussion, rather than silenced, not talked about, not having an organized way to do this that is part of the institution's offerings. I've often thought about that at this stage in my life, I could go for broke, I'm done with being employed, so I can just talk about all that I have done that were mistakes, that were flaws, that were re-traumatizing, that were good ways to achieve, but not so good ways to be healthy. And I think that is shared a lot across a lot of women of color.
Thank you for your question. I'm always happy to begin to think about how do we begin to remember Black women and Black females and the variety of experiences. And the first way, if I'm looking on the side of curriculum, just for a moment, is that I developed a Black Women's History course. That became revolutionary at my university. And I titled it, Critical Themes in African American Women's History, Sexuality, Violence, and the Love of Hip Hop. That's because that was good marketing. So that way I get you in there with hip hop, and then you're gonna come and learn about Black women. We're not gonna learn about Beyonce until we get to the last week. Because again, we got to look at where did she come from before all of that in its evolution. And in addition to that, everywhere I go I make history. It just kind of happens. I wanted my students rewarded because I was making them look historically, look at archival sources of where and how do we find Black females and Black women. So then I created a prize. So that way my students that they could be awarded by the institution for even centering these conversations on Black women in history. Now, to jump to another course that I had developed, again, the medical history course, when I was taking care of my mother, one thing that didn't come up in the talk is that my mother had 5 strokes. now almost 9 years ago. And I took care of her for 4 years. I was an at-home caregiver. And I was teaching this medical history course, and I had assigned the whitest book that there is, on purpose. The only book that every doctor will invoke whenever strokes come up. There's this book called My Stroke of Insight. It's interesting. It's a white woman who is a neurologist that her mother helped take care of her. And I asked my students, where am I in this book? Where's my mother? So from that, I created a program that I called the Limitless Project, Race and Stroke Survival in the 21st Century. And I made my students go find people of color because white people are not the only ones suffering from strokes. And more importantly, I had them interact with my mother, other black women, so we could be more attentive to the fact of what is the lived experience, and that way, forget a textbook. Even forget because I love signing TV. Forget TV for a moment. Deal with the real people in that real way. So that's another way. But then also, now I want to go more to outside of academia. And I thank you for even sharing about your moments of depression and anxiety, because that's huge. We don't share that. We keep it close. We don't talk about it. What does that mean? And then how do you rechannel the energy? But we also aren't attentive to that while there's the rise of yoga, the rise of meditation, the rise of find your peace, there's no black people. It's led by white people, and it's reserved for the perfect collegiate white female. Okay, so I'm gonna lead meditations. Okay, y'all need to de-stress, we're gonna have a drum circle. So meaning that finding these other ways of healing that include me, that include the community, and that do not, again, just sort of reserve this platform, again, just for the white conversation, even to have a dialogue around depression and anxiety. That's very hard for black women and black females in that way to ever admit that. So I've begun to create more platforms at our university so that we can be more attentive to what does that mean? Because yes, you should get therapy, but what are the other ways that we can do at home or within the community, or again, just creating and understanding that everyone deserves peace. So if I were to sort of go at it in that angle, I know that's not quite fully addressing where we're at now, but I feel like depression, anxiety, just high emotions have really come at a higher level than I've seen. So those are some other practical ways, because again, we could just privilege it just within these institutional halls, but we have to think about how does it play out when we're out in the real world. So again, that's just a few other things, but I'm still thinking through. So if you have any other ideas, maybe we can partner. I'm all about partnership.
So it's kind of part two of the question that was just asked. So specifically, what can black men do to bring our sisters to the forefront? Because I think it was Dr. Clark that said, if you want to know the condition of a nation, you have to look at how the women are treated. And I believe that us as African American people, we are in the state that, partially in the state we are because of the fact that we have neglected or forgotten the black woman. So what can we do?
Well, the first thing is to remember us. Second of all, to recognize and read the books and be a part of the dialogue and not see yourself outside of it. And beginning to want to know more. That becomes revolutionary in and of itself, because again, to think outside of oneself and begin to look at that bigger collective. Because in this history of even with the Tuskegee experiment, hardly ever do the females come up in many people's memory. And so yet, again, it is constantly invoking and reminding. Now, we get down to the programmatic, it all kind of depends on the university and it depends on the individual. But I think the first step is huge, because I've seen so many men overlook me just because it wasn't another male and because it wasn't another black male. So in that way, beginning to sort of check oneself and look at where and how can I begin to be a part of these dialogues, and even if that also means both on and offline. Because again, we can read the book, but then how are we beginning to be a part of these broader dialogues? So does that mean that then, not that we add on more to our schedules with book clubs or just whatever way, but making it known and making it more central in our minds about this engagement. That's just sort of off the top of my head, but acknowledging it, absolutely.
A cautionary note. I think that acting out, wanting to know more, certainly has got to be more than, tell me all about the black women. It's like we put the burden on the person, on the people who you want to know more. Well, just tell me all about it. So you already know that. That can't be. You got to do some homework so that you can say, I read this and this, and what do you think? Because, you know, that starts a conversation. So that's one thing. The other thing, word of caution, is if that really is going to put fire in your belly, it will never end. Because it'll go from that question to another question to another question, because the cumulativeness of everything that has systemically come together in different ecologies of systems of oppression are so embedded and so deep that it one question flows to another question. And so I think, as I was indicating in my reflections, that I think for one's health, you need to determine for yourself how much of that you can do without balancing it with other things like creating that which you want. So there is an interrogation of that which should not be, but there is also the other side of, well, if that shouldn't be, if you want to remember the black woman, then it seems to me we create moments and events and situations such that we are all there, truly there.
Ubiyagindi, non-common Dianaviyo, Navito Overlord, non-number. Hello everyone, my name is Diana and I'm from Navajo, Puebla, New Mexico. I'm very happy to be here today and I really enjoyed your talk. I am an Indigenous woman, which is a very forgotten part of this country's history and current narrative. And so I really appreciate those who bring light to forgotten stories and forgotten people. And people who are left out of the conversations that they really should be a part of. My question is geared more towards Dr. Cruz's talk, but Dr. Mustakeem, please weigh in with your expertise. So during Dr. Cruz's talk, I heard Stanford, the best of the public service honors program and underserved communities. And to me, that raises some red flags, and so I've a little bit wanted more clarity on how do you actually work with underserved communities in a true allyship manner. So there's a fine line, between effective collaboration with underserved communities and those with resources, and let me learn from you, at the expense of your well-being, your experiences, your traumas, and then leave, and that's it. And so how do you foster true allyship without, stepping into that historical, colonial, anthropological sort of approach to service-based learning?
As I said, I'm kind of a maverick, and certainly in my circles, I interrogate the word service itself as a colonialist-laden term. And that if you look at the ways by which, and you know this already, so I'll just mention in my history, the way they called benevolent assimilation of the Philippines under the imperial domination by the United States was to send Christian missionaries and educators, teachers. So you know that model already. So I never used the word underserved. So I don't think I said underserved. If I did, I slipped, because that is not in my language, because I criticize that a lot, that we do not serve. We work in collaboration as allies or in coalition with,
which requires an understanding one's positionality politically, and where that is a precondition for understanding whether we can be allies or be in coalition with. What I talked about the Public Service Scholars Program was that they had to fulfill two requirements. One was the ordinary honors requirements of their own department for a senior honors thesis. So that was one requirement, but the other requirement was to show or demonstrate how their research is of benefit to the public good or a particular group. It was up for some, to define what that meant. So it wasn't exactly prescriptive, it had to be following exactly these three things. But the program itself was, to some extent, an interrogation of how can scholarship actually not be exploited and instead be of benefit. And we read some very short books that that questions the binary that's made between basic research and applied. And because I had some students who would come in tears back and say, my research topic was not approved because it was too applied. And I would ask, well, what is meant by that? I said, well, it was too practical. It's going to be really of use to such and such and such and such, but it didn't produce basic research. And that particular one, for example, was interrogating the Olympic cities, the choices of Olympic cities, and what it did, like Atlanta, the criminalization of public spaces because they didn't want the homeless to be around, and so forth and so on, how much did it really cost, and that was to produce an executive summary so that other potential host cities, community organizers, could have all the data that they needed in order to be prepared for the vetting of those Olympic villages in their cities and what it would do to the economically disadvantaged people. So that's just an example, and I'm sorry if I misspoke, but I don't use underserved.
My name is Denzel Ville, first year MPH student here at Tuskegee. I want to speak in regards to the actual engagement system that you were speaking on and how we should engage with the black race. But I wanted to touch on, is it even important to engage with the white race as well? Like, is it important for us to share our lens and our perspective to them as well, and so we can create like more inclusive settings? Because at white institutions, you still have a large amount of black students that attend those universities as well. So when you present these things at those institutions, like how do we present it in those type of settings to kind of still get the message across to different environments, pretty much?
Sure. Well, I probably could speak more in class. I could probably speak more in class because, to be honest with you, I don't do all of anything. I don't do all black classes. I don't do all white. I call deans in order to make sure there's representation of everyone. Because I find that the learning is not as high in ways that I want. Because then what happens when you do go to med school and you really are the only? And how are you going to begin to translate these experiences where it isn't just going to turn into some big blow up, some big argument? So in that way, I would say my medical history course, more than any other, has made me really think, like, in a variety of ways to keep us engaged across racial. And that way, and the learning has gone through the roof. I cannot emphasize it enough. So yes, it is important to engage, to share. But also, I assign books that make white students and white families have to deal with what does this mean. Like one book, Wrong Place, Wrong Time, looking at all of these significant shootings where you're finding young black males that are ending up in the ER. And so that becomes a whole different world that white students then oftentimes are confronted with for the first time, and then other students perhaps can speak about that and what does it mean. Because again, it's not just about the giving of care. We have to look at that past and all of its evolution, but it's extremely important to begin to interact within and beyond one's group, one's community, one's race. I just can't emphasize it enough, because before I came up here, I was texting all these former students, some who were in med school, this, that, and other, and then white, black, male, any of it, all of it, didn't matter. Meaning that a variety of races and a variety of people who got it, who understood the importance of it, and then their careers took off in other ways that without that, they may not. So we may take it for granted, and I know how hard it is, but I've seen people grow significantly in that way. It's just about learning how to begin to share in ways that, even if we're not revealing at all, the aspects can still be seeds of new beginnings for other people to come and learn. Thank you so much for that question. Sure.
Does anyone else have a question?
This question is directed toward Dr. Mustakeem. Yeah, I would like to get your thoughts on reparations, and when you think it would ever come about in our lifetime.
Oh, all right, we get right to it. Okay. Yeah, it's starting to come back up now that the elections are going to be coming in next year, and it sounds like reparations are about to be a part of the conversation. Oh boy. The first thing I would say is everyone needs to read this book called The Dead, What America Owes to, by Randall Robinson. That begins to look at the evolution and where and how Black people contributed to the building of America. That's one of the most just important books. Now, that said, I'm a little on the fence, only because there's been so many different ways in which reparations will come up, and I will admit too that the story that I shared with you all, there's a film out that it connects actually to a large slave trading family out of Rhode Island. So you have the Browns. Some people may know of the Browns, but in fact there was another family that had more consecutive generations involved in the slave trade, more than the Brown, and that would be the DeWolfs. And they created a documentary called Traces of the Trade. And I don't know if some people have seen that, and that is where you have this Rhode Island family that is retracing their connection to slavery and the slave trade, and then the conversations begin to come up around reparations, and then seeing them sort of deal with that within the church, and what does that mean? Personally, I think that they sort of got around it, but yet when you put yourself out there as a family, that's completely different, I think, than a historian sort of writing about it. I think we're still at a place we've got to really think about what does that mean and what do we want for the future, because it can be right now in a symbolic gesture. But for me, when I think about the repairing, the restoration in that way of our understanding, we still have to understand what happened. And does that mean then that we create new schools, we create new curriculums? Because I'm thinking about 100 years from now. And so what would that mean to either give money, give education, what does that mean for now, and what can that mean in 100 years? So, meaning I don't have a perfect answer, but I do realize that my book, it will, and inevitably it should be used in the conversation so we can begin to remember that this did happen. But as far as me saying it should be a particular way, or any of that, I don't have any deep ideas on it at all. It's just, I think that we're at a critical moment where we need to be talking about it, and we need to be talking about it in a meaningful way, not just knee-jerk, but to actually be historically informed, so that way then you're looking at what can that look like, so that way it won't be undone, we won't regress in those ways. So I think just kind of where we're at as a world, and even more just as a people, we have to really stop and think, where are we even in the learning process? Because I can tell you, inside the classroom has definitely made me think a lot more about, we're far, but we're not. And so one of the biggest things is education. And you have, without that education of understanding, whether medically, historically, socially, economically, it all becomes important. But then it depends on who's at the table to begin to negotiate all of these ways of which, again, to start the process. But I think we're going to really see it play out a whole lot over this next year. I don't know if you want to add to it or not.
I try not to say anything. I am Ida Carruthers, and I am privileged to serve on the National African American Reparations Commission. And so for 40 years or more, a group of us have been carrying in our bellies the narrative of reparations that really goes back to 19th, 18th century. And it's almost, not almost, it is a sacred obligation and responsibility for us to demand reparations. Not in terms of money, but as a process of healing ourselves. Reparations is to repair the trauma, and it begins with that. There has been long strategic action to finally get John Conyers' bill, H.R. 40, to the point where we do now have the candidates talking about reparations. You can go all over the world, which I've done, from India to Europe to Geneva, and you now have World Council of Churches and white people talking about reparations. The DeWolf family is very interesting. I happen to know well Tom and Katrina, who are the ones who did the movie that you spoke of. It was that side of the family, but that family was ruptured over the slave trade. Katrina went to seminary and was doing a paper on the transatlantic slave trade only to discover that it was her family, which was the largest family in the trade. And as a result of that, when she started peeling back the histories of her family, they found out that the DeWolf family split. Those who benefited with the money are on the West Coast, and those who didn't are on the East Coast. So as you were speaking and as you were talking about Captain DeWolf, what became very clear to me would be the call for Tom to have a conversation. As you read the excerpt from your book, I just wonder, as we talk about this journey of reparatory justice and reparations, and the CARICOM, the nations in the Caribbean are doing the most with it, but I would commend all of us to go to the IBW.org website, where we have our 10-point plan. It's very much in parallel with the CARICOM, the Caribbean Nation State 10-point plan, and it's very specific about remedy. And international law requires that if, in fact, you name it a crime against humanity, you have to then declare reparations, and you have to find a remedy, whatever that remedy is.
I encourage people to look at Traces of the Trade. Although in the documentary, the story, which I read from, actually connects to that family, you barely have any evidence that it ever happened. In fact, Tom DeWolf came to my class. I wasn't impressed because he did not want to engage the conversation. I was teaching the slavery and memory in American popular culture. So it just sort of became a reminiscing of these black moments that my students really wanted to engage him. They read his book, they saw the documentary, they read the article, but then it's sort of not dealing with it. I met Katrina Brown. It's definitely been very interesting with that family in the sense of, and yes, inevitably they'll split the family, like who wants to talk about that? Because in any family, who wants to talk about the fact that you're walking, living, and thriving in some sort of legacy? And again, benefit can be defined on all sides. But I encourage us to still read the book, see the narrative, and engage more. And I'm really excited to know that we do have people who are committed in that way. Because again, I can't always answer the question, because to do that writing and to begin to go dig and actually say, this is what I'm doing, I had to battle to even get in the doors to be able to write that. So then it is what we do with sort of the history learned. But
I just also wanted to mention that we can't forget the reparations, truth, and reconciliation for our Native brothers and sisters. And those of you who are here who know about it, maybe you wish to speak up, but I spent time in Minnesota last summer following some Lakota and Dakota guides to understand the land that was taken is not even the right word. So
we are living in complex interweavings of many devastations in the hands by human beings. And I'm, at my age 70, I feel I am now just about ready and prepared, having gotten rid of a lot of nonsense, to do the real work of trying to understand the world we live in ways that are removed from the noise and the noise. I think you know what that means. But it also means it's really, really heavy on the heart. Because when you really try to absorb the stories of lots of people, and my neighbor who's Cambodian lived through the killing fields. My father who went through the Bataan Death March. It is a miracle that we have many, many thousands, millions, moments of goodness. And I'm trying to interrogate why is it we don't have as many names for those collective, systemic, organized ways of goodness that we have so readily identified all the pathologies and systemic oppressions in the various isms that we have mountains of scholarship about. It just strikes me that, well, I have this little exercise, I'll just tell it to you, you don't have to do it. Take a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, and fold it in half. On the one side, I say, got a minute, I want you to write down just a word or a phrase to indicate what it is you would like to have stopped or you should not have in the world because it's evil, it's bad, it's destructive for whatever reasons you think. Just give a name or a phrase and write as fast as you can for 1 minute. So they do that. Stop the watch and they say, okay, go to the other side of the page, do the same thing, a word or a phrase, to name all the things, but it has to have a name or a phrase only, not a huge paragraph, about all the good things that you wish to have happen. And inevitably, the half page, the second half page, is like 2 or 3 items, and the other page is like a whole long list. There's something about that bothers me. And so I've been wanting to do this pilgrimage to Le Chambon, actually, to try to understand why this peasant village is just not really well known, or why isn't anybody interested, why it doesn't make news that a whole village conspired for years to house people fleeing the Holocaust. How do they do this without making it into a Hollywood thing, you know? To just to try to understand the goodness that does happen daily, that we somehow don't have names for, and so we don't have a way of having it be cumulative in our memories. I don't know where I got into that, but I guess thinking about reparations and truth and reconciliation, I'm thinking, should we not also have a process by which we are imagining what it is that we want society to be like, with all of us in it? And does that include, perhaps, simply coming to the conclusion that with some people, we just need to fight? I'm wrestling with that question. The question earlier about, well, if, you know, that you can have a discussion with common ground, I think at some point, I think it is ethically and morally right to make a decision that there are some people who you just simply need to fight. And to not fight them is irresponsible. And so I'm thinking that there are some people who are conspiring and calculating and strategizing to kill many of us.
It's true.
And we need to be smart enough not to be morally in the same camp, but not unaware and not mistakenly innocent, to not be standing ready to fight. And so that's something I've been thinking about. How do we fight?
Can I don't have a question. I just want to make a comment. And I believe you guys can hear me. I'm a PK. And we were brought up to speak.
You know what PK is?
And Pastor's kid. Right. I look around this room and I see a lot of generations, and I'm so proud. I came here replacing a colleague. Didn't know what I was gonna get, but I sat here and I'm in awe. I'm actually was moved.
Okay.
I sat here and I wept quietly. I was gonna sit down here and not say nothing because I know time is valuable and I don't want to hold anybody back, but the dialogue was awesome. You guys keep it going. The conversation needs to keep going beyond this room. This room needs to be filled with your grandkids. Okay, I got 3 wonderful children, one of which graduated from Alabama State University, and today I can proudly say he is an occupational therapist doctor. I have a son who graduated from Florida A&M University. I fought with that school every day, let me tell you, but it was worth it. He's an officer in the U.S. Army, proud, served and he was deployed 5 times. So I know what it is to kneel and pray. So by saying so, I look around the room, I see praying people, okay, which gotta keep going even to the younger generation. And I say that because I'm 59. You look at me like, what's she talking about? Younger generation? I've been told I look good, right? But I look around this room and there are people in here that I hope I live as long as they have and look as good as they have. For you to keep talking to my children and your grandchildren, because it got to keep on going. It should not die in this room. Okay? So keep talking. I said I have 3 kids. My daughter is like the baby. She's 30. She's a biologist major. And she is right now saying, Mama, I love to do research, but I think there's something more that she needs to do. And she's actually looking in your area.
All right.
And I'm leaving a letter to her then. However, these women have been phenomenal. I have listened. I've taken it in. But it can't just stay here.
Right.
All your questions need to take off outside of this room. Gather the perspective of other people. Ask the same questions elsewhere and see what response you get. You need to write her and let her know what y'all came up with, because her study, her research needs to keep on going. It's just a book, but she needs to do a follow-up.
No pressure.
You guys complimented each other very well, I must say. The age difference. And I sat here and fell in love with both of you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Warren.
Thank you.
But I was, sorry, I'm gonna ask a question. We had this gentleman right here who wanted to ask a question as well. So I wanted to ask about the fear of rejection and how it works against us, which I feel like is something you were touching on. So I wrote a note that said, we want so badly to be wanted, even by the people who enslave us. And I was basically thinking about how the multitude of ways that manifests itself in what we're seeing today. And even in thinking about the United States Public Health Service study, where in my research at least, I saw a lot of the men who weren't taken in as part of that so-called study felt like they were left out of something and wanted to be a part of it. So I just wanted to know, how do we work through that feeling, and how has that manifested itself personally in your careers and in the work that you do?
Sure. Wow, rejection comes in many forms. I say that because, again, you all heard me talk about refused slaves in that conversation, because, again, we privilege those who were taken across, and we don't think about those who were left behind, and thus refused and rejected as valuable. But if I were to think even more on another level that connects to this, was the rejection of the article, as well as my book almost being blackballed. And that meant, for those who may read it, you may not have really ever read it because someone did not see the value in that. And I have had to battle with that rejection within academia and then still sustain myself. That meant where I thought I may be leaving academia because of the blackball experience, but I was still staying in that way. But as far as personally, no, I'm less so in some sense. But I just think about the rise of these studies, and then yet how you try to attract people. And that becomes a whole other conversation, because when I had put on a program around Henrietta Lacks, there were some other people that were like, well, you need to help recruit people for these studies we need. No, you know, there's a very delicate relationship with African Americans in these so-called studies, as we know, and thus us being here. So rejection, and the racial rejection, has taken very interesting sort of outplays. And then when we think about just the gender dynamics, that becomes a whole other thing. But it's what we do in terms of the resiliency and bouncing back. If we were to sort of say, I got rejected from, in fact, I got rejected from every graduate school except one, and then I got a full ride. So obviously that meant that the path opened up. But it is learning how to deal with no. It is learning how to say, okay, if you say no, well, I'm going to keep moving forward in that way and staying determined. So I know I'm only telling you what you already know and what we all know, but nonetheless staying strong even in those stories that some people want to leave, up under the dustiest thing possible, but digging that out.
Just very short. I think the rejection I fear the most is self-loathing.
Mm.
It is a rejection of the self.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes, for some people like me, a lifetime to understand that, to recognize it, to understand the racialized aspect of it, to not be the cute Oriental girl. I used to have long hair until I realized I was being exoticized. Cut it off, things like that. Not being taken seriously because of things that I may say that are heretical within academic life. I used to always quote everything and cite everything, and just dropping that became a process of becoming myself.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing when is the right time to be citing authority. Correctly and appropriately to be accountable, as opposed to be wanting to belong.
Mm-hmm.
There is a difference. And also understanding the difference between, and I've been in a lot of institutions where they do a lot of so-called world-class research, to recognize the difference between deep intellectual labor and academic performance. Huge difference. So I met lots of academic performers who were academic achievers, but many of them did not have a voice. And I could not have a long, deep intellectual conversation with them on matters of consequence. So I think rejection is a complex thing. And as we know from Frantz Fanon and others who have studied internalized oppression is huge. It's almost easier to bear the repulsion by other people because of one's skin or look or genotype or whatever than it is to struggle with the internalization of the oppressor's lenses casting on oneself.
And I'll add also that I'm the first Black person to ever get tenure in my department, so that meant that I was hell-bent that I belong, I can do this, and I'm not buying into the ideas of the rejection in terms of how behavior can sort of play out in that regard. So if I were to say, that is like my living legacy ongoing in that way. So.
Good evening. My name is Clement Jelks, and I am a descendant. And while sitting here, I was trying to figure out how to form my question and statement, I guess. In my limited reading about the war between the North and the South, the Civil War, that it was basically based on economics when you get down to it because of the slave being profit and whatever. But after the war, the North having seized a lot of property from the South, and some old animals, you might say, mules and whatever. But it was basically, the North decided to give some of the slaves returned to the South a mule and 40 acres.
Oh, right.
You heard the term.
Yes.
Now my question is, was that not a form of reparation at that time? And I know the term may not have been used at that time, but could that have been a concept of restorative justice?
Sure, if it had gone like nationwide, it was a beginning. I don't think that it really lasted that long. We may remember it more with Spike Lee in the name of his production of his company in that regard. But yes, you're absolutely right. In thinking about that we had seen those beginnings and how it plays out later on will be different. But thank you for being here.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's have a hand clap for the presenters. What an awesome job. Let's have what about our two student moderators? Amen. We are asked Dr. Warren to come now to give his final statements. But ladies and gentlemen, did you have a good time today? Amen. We want Dr. Warren to come down and say our last words. I just want to remind you that tomorrow we begin at 8 a.m., which means that the boat is leaving the hotel at about what, 7:20? Yeah, 7:20, right?
No, we said our schedule is hold on. 6:45.
6:45.
There were two bus schedules.
Okay, so there are two bus schedules. 6:45. I suggest that after the tour this evening, after you get your final bite, go to bed at 6:45. Be in waiting because we will commence at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Also, don't forget that as we finish this session, that the tour bus is going to leave to take us on the tour. So those of you who are going, please proceed to the bus. Dr. Warren.
This bill is in session, y'all. This bill is in session. Thank you. It seems busy because it is. It seems like a long day because it is. All that you feel is true. But you can't get any better than this. And it only happens once a year. And every year it gets better and better and better. So yes, Dr. Ebo's been working a whole year to make sure that everything goes smooth. So she said 6:45, and it is what it is. And what you have to appreciate, if y'all are leaving at 6:45, we're up at 6 here, trying to make sure that you receive as you deserve to be. Just bear with us, we're gonna have a couple more days. But you have to surely know that this was a wonderful session. And let's thank both of our speakers. I'm not going to go through the same routine about the pen case for our keynoter and the coins. You all know the story. But I'll give them to them to show our appreciation, so folks will know that they have been to Tuskegee. We didn't pay them. They will know that they've been to Tuskegee. And let me tell you, you may feel a little tired, but what we're going to do this evening, right now is go to a place that some of you have been, but every time it's a renewed feeling. We're going to have a conversation with Attorney Fred Gray. Okay, now, you won't get that any place but here. Okay, and there is Tuskegee History Museum, and it traces this place from the beginning. The transition from different ethnic groups who have been here, come and gone, and why. So everybody in this room is represented over at the Tuskegee History Museum. And more importantly, you'll get a chance to see at least every name of every man that we know that was in that horrendous subject. You'll see their name. That doesn't mean that's all that we're in. That's all we know. You'll see some pictures on the wall of people that we think were in the study, but we also know that some of the pictures have no name.
Right.
They put the pictures up there, and who is that? We don't know who it is. We don't even know if they were in it. So we're struggling to figure out to place the name with the picture. So it's an ongoing journey, and you really will appreciate it. I want to encourage you not to miss this. I do it every year, and I learn something new from Attorney Gray every year. And he calls me the day before the event. Do I do something different this time? And I always say, do what you do. And it's different. It's different because of you. Because the question that you raised with me, or with the staff at the Biological Center, we don't know the answer. And we've learned enough over time to say, I don't know. So you won't get some answers that we don't have. And most of them we don't have. And the answers really rest within these families. They know, and we're struggling to tell the truth with a capital T. Because we know what's being told is not true. Somebody made it up, and we're clearing it up. And as we prepare to go over to the museum, I want to just recognize Dr. Brandon Isom, who is here. Brandon, you stand up, sir, Dr. Isom. And I point him out to you because he's engaged in a very important project, funded project, to provide a theoretical foundation for this thing we're calling public health ethics. So he's going around the country to talk to all these biological centers and these scholars and pharmaceuticals to ask them what do they think it is. Because what he's found out thus far, he's just beginning, is the notion of public health ethics, they don't know what it is. So we're claiming it. Okay? We're claiming it. And it evolves out of your lived experience. And that's what we need to hear. But there's a notion that I learned in one of the schools I was in, called praxis. Not practice, praxis. It's do something and then reflect. Don't just do something, that's just busyness, it's a waste of time. Do something and then reflect. So you're going over to the History Museum, that's something we're doing. But the reflection is so important. And have the courage to ask the question. The Senate family members will do it. They ask them empowering questions. I won't ask them. But they asked him, and Attorney Gray answers them. So if you have some questions that you want to ask me, I don't know. Raise him with Attorney Fred Gray, and he will tell you the best that he knows. What I will tell you that he may not tell you is that he took on the federal government. Young black lawyer from Alabama took on the federal government, and nobody would support him. He had to take a mortgage out on his house to continue. Now, we didn't win, but we didn't lose. But we won. So we're ready to go on the. Oh, I'm gonna give this out to these folks. But I'm gonna do it. Yeah. I should do it formally, okay? Because you are who you are. Because you are who you are. We're gonna present this. You put it on your desk at that Harvard University where you attend.
Got it.
Because it says trustee on it.
All right, I'm happy to.
And they'll know.
That's right, they'll know that we're gonna be doing future partnerships.
We already are. And here's the point. And you know the story.
Tell me again.
Yes, somebody. If she wants to hear, I wasn't gonna say it.
Because you do it so well.
See, somebody has one of those coins, and they didn't get it from Tuskegee. What did they do? They stole. They stole.
They have stolen.
That's right. And they didn't steal.
I certainly did.
Thank you. Okay. And Ms. Cruz. We met at CDC because a colleague referred her to me, and my colleague said, you need to bring her to CDC, and after she got to CDC, then Dr. Howard said, you need to bring her to Tuskegee. And so we wanted to have her stay in one of the hotels, whatever, and what she said to us, that no, I need to be in this place. You heard her say, I need to get permission. I hope y'all heard that. You get permission. And so as you walk this campus, just know that you've been granted permission. Okay, because we asked permission for you to be here. That's why but she asked permission for herself. It's a powerful statement. I'm going to give you this coin. Thank you. That does the same thing, and you know the story, and we're just so pleased. Thank you. And now you know more about that story. We're proud that you're here. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much.
I have an update. Let me say quickly. Diana, Zara Muhammad, Akil, and Calvin, please see me up here as soon as we're finished. And for the rest of you, I went outside and I negotiated on your behalf. The ship leaves at 7:30. So we begin exactly at 8. There's only 15 minutes to get here. So the ship, the boat, I'm from the island, we use boats. The bus leaves at 7:30. So please be on the bus at 7:30 at the hotel. All right, thank you very much for being with us today. Blessings upon you. Take care.